So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last session in the Women's Health Innovation Conference. And I'm delighted that you're interested in drug treatment in pregnancy because it's a really important area and very much neglected. We're going to talk about bridging the innovation gap, challenges and opportunities for innovation in obstetric drug development. The pregnancy market is underexplored but holds significant potential. The market is often seen as risky due to difficulties associated with conducting clinical trials on pregnant patients. But there's a lot of interest and willingness from the pregnant population to take part in clinical trials. And so we'd like to bust that myth from the very beginning. And if you want to ask us further about that, we're very happy to take questions later on. So this panel, we're going to explore the challenges and the opportunities within the market. My name is Anna David. I'm a professor of obstetrics and maternal fetal medicine at University College London and UCLH in London. And I've been working in drug development really for about the last 20 years, trying to take a novel drug for a pregnancy condition called fetal growth restriction, where the fetus stops growing, trying to take that into the clinic. And it's fair to say that women want it. We've made a lot of progress. We're not quite there yet, but we've got experience of running clinical trials in pregnancy. So perhaps I can move on to the panel to introduce themselves. So Peter, over to you.
Hello, I'm Peter Brocklehurst. I'm Emeritus Professor of Women's Health at the University of Birmingham. And I'm a perinatal epidemiologist as well as an obstetrician, and I've been running clinical trials in pregnancy for 30 years.
Amin, over to you. Thank you.
My name is Amin Rostami, and I have got actually dual position. 50% of the time I am a professor of systems pharmacology at the University of Manchester, and the other 50% I am the chief scientific officer and senior vice president for research and development in the biggest biosimulation company for the drug development called Certara.
Hello, nice to meet you all. My name is Jan Daru. So I am different to these people because I am a regulator. But my background is I trained in obstetrics and gynecology, and I am the expert assessor at the Medicines Health and Regulatory Agency. For those of you who don't know what that is, we are the UK equivalent of the FDA. And I hate saying that, but that's it.
Brilliant. And very sadly, Jenny Myers is unable to join us. She's a professor of obstetrics and maternal medicine at University of Manchester, but she has given us her response to the questions that we've pitched to the panel. So when you're thinking about taking medications in pregnancy, there are three different groups of women that we need to think about. So women may start taking medication in pregnancy for a newly acquired medical condition. For example, they might develop a urinary tract infection in pregnancy, a chest infection, and they might have to take antibiotics. And it's fair to say that most of these drugs have not been formally tested in pregnancy. Would I be right, Jan? Yes. Okay. Did many of you know that? So women and their clinicians take risks every time they prescribe a drug because most of the drugs that we use have not been formally tested. Secondly, women may take newly developed medication for a particular medical condition before they conceive. So particularly thinking about novel drugs which might make women fitter and therefore they become more healthy and able to actually think about having a pregnancy. So for example, we might take triple combination therapy for cystic fibrosis. Almost certainly, those new drugs will never have been tested in pregnancy. And it's up to the woman and her clinician to decide, should she stop taking the drug and potentially risk her condition becoming worse, or should she continue taking the drug and risk potentially teratogenesis or some kind of problem with the baby? And is that fair? I personally don't think that's very fair. And then thirdly, we have pregnancy conditions complications which are common in high and low middle income countries. I'm thinking about preeclampsia, which affects probably about 5% of all pregnant women. Preterm birth affects around 10% of all pregnant patients. Fetal growth restriction, again, around about 10% of all pregnancies. And we require novel approaches to drugs, but we have no drugs specifically developed to treat these conditions. So how can we safely develop them? So I'm going to hand over to Peter and ask you, first of all, what do you think, what are the barriers to innovation in obstetric drug development? I'm going to come and sit down here.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the biggest problems is that, as you probably are aware, most drugs that we have now are developed by the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry are not interested in pregnancy. And why? Well, thalidomide from the 1950s has cast a very long shadow. And you all know about thalidomide, I'm not going to repeat that, but there are more contemporary examples like sodium valproate, an anti-epileptic drug, and its impact on pregnancy. So it's a massive barrier. Pregnancy is seen as just being too risky, particularly for new drug development, whereas we are desperate for new drug development for conditions, as Anna said, preeclampsia and preterm birth, where the incidence of preeclampsia and preterm birth has barely changed in 40 or 50 years because we're not developing new therapies, where babies die every day in hospitals in the UK and by their hundreds throughout the world, and pregnant women die of these conditions because we don't have effective therapies. So we need to think about a way to try and incentivize industry to work in this field. And I think we need to de-risk it for them. We need to think about what it is that drives their desire to avoid pregnancy and how can we overcome that. And I was responsible for a couple of reports that came out from Birmingham Health Partners and the Academy of Medical Sciences, trying to think about ways to de-risk pregnancy, where industry could work in partnership more closely with academia, but also with government, because I think that's absolutely crucial to underwrite some of the risk associated with new drug development. You'll hear lots of us talking this afternoon about the fact that this is not the 1950s. We're much better at developing drugs and being more reassured about safety before we'd take any new drug into a human pregnant population. But still, we need to acknowledge that there is a potential risk, and if that risk is realised, if something bad happens to either the women or the babies, then there needs to be a mechanism where it's not always the pharmaceutical company which will be threatened with legal action, potentially for many millions or tens of millions of pounds. So some sort of novel relationship where government underwrites that risk so that it can de-risk it for industry. And also we need to think about the market and whether the market is truly attractive. Even if we take that risk of being sued away, can we also make it more attractive to invest in that area? You know, if you develop a new statin, somebody's on a statin for many, many years, decades potentially. Pregnancy is short by comparison, and it may be an acute episode in pregnancy, so your ability to market a drug may be very short. So can we do, has been done in pediatrics, and give companies longer patents so that they have got exclusive use of the drug for longer to recoup some of their investment? It's been done in other areas like pediatrics. We could do the same in obstetrics. So I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that sort of macro environment where if industry is not going to get involved in pregnancy, no matter how sophisticated our models are, how determined women are to be tested, if there's no development of new drugs, we're not going to get anywhere. So that initial reluctance has to in some way be overcome. And I'll finish my little rant by saying we should be in a good place in the UK. The UK is a really good place to do drug development trials because we have the NHS and we can follow up those fetuses who are exposed in utero for the rest of their lives through the NHS systems. So we can do really long-term follow-up, potentially really cheaply. We also have a head of the National Institute of Health Research and a head of the Office of Life Sciences who is an obstetrician who has written about the dearth of drug development in pregnancy. So she's going to be helpful. And, you know, we've got a new government. And certainly when this current government was in opposition, I certainly had plenty of meetings with ministers who were in opposition who were very interested in this topic, two of whom had had babies during COVID, and were initially told they couldn't have the vaccine because it would be dangerous for the baby, and then they had to have the vaccine, even though it had never been tested on pregnant women. And then they realised this huge gap that was happening where pregnant women were excluded from clinical trials of the vaccine. So I think we should be in a good position to negotiate that sort of joint working and settlement in a way that could reassure industry. But to me, that if we don't overcome that, everything else is fiddling around the edges, which would be a great shame and a missed opportunity.
So, Peter, I mean, one of the other issues is that it's really difficult to get insurance for drugs trials in pregnancy. So this was flagged up by Jenny Myers, who was trying to get insurance for a trial of beetroot juice in pregnancy, which was actually eventually defined as a drug. So what do you think is the issue, and how can we get round it?
So the issues for the insurers, and I've had lots of meetings with the insurers about this, is that they can't really judge whether a trial in pregnancy is risky or not, because they base this in actuarial terms, like all insurance is. It's based on the number of previous drug trials done in pregnancy where there's been no financial liability. Well, they just don't have enough evidence to base that on. We faced the same issue. I was very involved with the Medicines in Children initiative a few years ago, where there were very few trials of medicine use in children, particularly small children. And it was really difficult to get insurance for that. Now there's been hundreds of trials of medicines used in children, and there's been very, very, very few adverse consequences of that. So the insurers are now able to appropriately risk assess those trials, and the insurance premiums have come down, and it's much easier to get. It's a vicious circle, because until you start doing lots of drug trials in pregnancy, you can't get to that position. But again, we need somebody like government to underwrite this. It's been done in other areas, not of healthcare, but in other areas. One of my reports I co-chaired with Eliza Manningham-Buller, who's in the House of Lords, who used to be head of MI5. She's got a very different perspective on things, which was really helpful. And you know, the government were underwriting companies in terms of acts of terrorism, because they couldn't afford the insurance that would cover them for acts of terrorism, and the government underwrote that, and as far as I know, there's still never been any need to pay out. But the principle of underwriting made it happen, made it possible that people could get insurance which covered them for acts of terrorism. So there are examples out there that we could borrow from and learn from.
Fantastic. So if we're not going to test drugs in women, we're going to have to start out by testing them preclinically in animal models. And of course, it's very difficult to do that because there are no specific models of preeclampsia. There are few about growth restriction, but the sort of mechanism of action doesn't really follow human pregnancy because the placenta is really unique in humans. But there are other ways of doing this. I mean, I'm going to pass to you to ask about your work in modelling, which means that we don't have to do this in animals, but we can do this using a computer. How does it work?
It would be useful, actually, I explained that, this schizophrenic, situation that I am in with this 50%, because to explain how these models work or don't work, I have to actually explain, as a scientific person, working in the university, we are all the time focusing on the things that we don't have and we want to have. While in the company side, we actually try to focus on the things we have and we want to make better use of it and with whatever we have got. So this has actually helped me to basically feed from these to each other over the last 25 years. But it has also, made me to, as I said, to think as two completely separate individuals. So when we come to the pregnancy side of the things, it is helpful, perhaps to start by saying we started our first piece of work sponsored by Food Standards Agency, FSA, in 2009. After that, we had several actually studies that they were sponsored by Women's actually Health section of the FDA. So for several years, as you said, there was no interest from the drug companies at all, which basically shows, confirms that what you were saying. But over these years, by gathering what we actually had already on the science side and putting them piece by piece into the models, we could establish, at least, with the FDA, work that we have actually published already, that we can define how the drugs are going to be handled differently in pregnant women. If everything was handled in the same way for all drugs, let me just explain to everybody. This is easy because it's going to be, for instance, eliminated from body 2 times faster, or it's going to be 3 times, slower. The problem that we have got, it is not like that. So, for instance, the enzymes responsible for getting rid of caffeine when you are drinking the coffee, during pregnancy, they get lazier. And as a result, 1 cup of coffee in a pregnant woman, it works like a 4 cup of coffee in another person. While the enzymes that they are responsible for majority of the drugs that we actually have, there are 2 enzymes very well known, CYP3A4 and 2D6. Both of them, they are induced. Even CYP2D6, many people basically say that it's not induced. In pregnancy, actually it is induced. So understanding these pieces of information over the years, putting them together in these models, this hasn't been anything new. We were just gathering these piece by piece, putting into these models, helped to get the confidence in part of colleagues in FDA that we can say something sensible, which may help with what Peter is saying. What is the insurance when they want, this is the likelihood of having this much, it's going to get into the baby, this much, that much. We have started the same thing with the placental and transfer of the drugs through placenta, which, as you said, we can't use, the animal studies because, human placenta is very, very different. But we are now using many of these bottom-up models, not just in, during different, sort of stages of pregnancy and transfer to the fetus, etc., but we are using for the lactation. We have got transporters, etc., and they are accepted by FDA. And guess what? Now I told you that none of the drug companies were interested. We have got now a PhD student sponsored by BMS, a drug company, fully on the lactation models, and how we can, and what they are putting as a result of this model goes into the label of the drug. They are not filling up the study that we are not going to do, but they are actually filling up the study that never was going to happen.
And do you have enough data on what happens in pregnancy and complications? Because you might have data about normal pregnancy, but I think there is insufficient information about what happens in pregnancies that have complications like preeclampsia or fetal growth restriction, or perhaps, for example, gestational diabetes. So how can we get around that? How much data do you need?
The data that we get for our models, first of all, they are not drug dependent. Drug dependence and what we want to as a confirmation, verification, validation, credibility, many other words that people use, that comes later on, obviously, from clinical study. What we are interested in our models are the sets of, the biological changes that they are happening. And for many of these, earlier on, we were discussing with Peter, we have got now new tools such as liquid biopsy, which in fact started from the pregnancy area, when you can actually have some idea of what is happening in different organs in the body without actually punching into that particular organ. We can know what's happening in your liver without getting into your liver, just by harvesting from plasma the liver pieces that they are floating around. So many of these kind of information, if we specifically go and do in the kind of, sort of specific, cases that you are talking about, that would be very helpful for our models. But unfortunately, getting these actually funded, etc., at the moment is not that easy.
But there are technological breakthroughs that will be coming through. Well, that sounds really exciting. So, Jan, over to you in terms of how do we get these drugs through from a regulatory perspective? Because it is quite a minefield, isn't it? But I know the MHRA is doing a lot in this area.
Yes, thank you. So I think I just want to take a step back before we pursue the pregnancy route to say, just circling back to some of the other speakers that spoke this morning, because I was listening really avidly to all the discussions that were happening about how 51% of the population are women, and a proportion of those, maybe 80% of those at some point in their lives, might choose to get pregnant. 60% of those women will probably be taking a medicine. And if you look at the label, 90% of medicines have no pregnancy-specific messaging on their label. That means we have no data to tell anyone, clinicians, or actually pregnant women, that this product is safe. And that's a problem. It's a problem for me. It's definitely a problem for you and for those women that are in your lives. So how can you solve this? First of all, a woman is not just a vessel for a pregnancy, okay? Anna, I know you've said this multiple times, and Peter, you've said this too. We are listening. The agency is taking this really, really seriously. And it's not just in the agency, it's wider government as well. I think people are recognizing that this is a problem. Currently, regulators globally are trying to improve inclusion of of trials generally. So clinical trials are what you need in order to have a drug licensed in any jurisdiction, okay? So if you have a product that you're developing and you're in a tech company or you're in a drug company, you might go from the different phases of development. I'm just going to mention this here to ensure that people here understand what I'm saying. Your phase 1 all the way up to your phase 4. Your phase 1 is really about showing that your drug is safe and that it's doing what you think it's going to do. And that's the stuff that me as a regulator, I care about. I want to know that your product is safe before it's efficacious. And this is where we face all these problems in pregnancy, because we don't have the right models that tell us that when you're assessing safety, perhaps in an animal model, you know, okay, I know how this drug might work in cancer, but we don't have those in pregnancy. That's where some of the work that Amin is describing is really useful. So for those of you that work in those industries or work in those companies, use that data, use that as supportive evidence to say, we have an idea of how this might work. The agency, as all regulators are, appear to be a barrier. We are not. We are on your side. But you need to prove to us that what you're doing is going to be safe. And that, I think, is part of the problem here. It's that understanding that actually there are ways of thinking about this safely. They might not be the traditional route of doing, your classic preclinical development, using your animal models, working to see if they are, they're getting your target organs aligned. And we know that in pregnancy, specifically in preeclampsia, we don't have good models. That's not to say that all animal models are not effective. I also want to mention that at the moment there is a public consultation, which I think has closed, Anna, you've told me this, where we are piloting some equality and diversity inclusion. Now, I accept women's inclusion is not an EDI issue. I'm very cross about this, because it's not. Women are 51% of the population. But please engage in this for those of you that work in the tech industry. There is a pilot that's going to be launched in 2025 in March, where we're going to ask sponsors, so both academic as well as industry representations, to create an inclusion plan, thinking about this really early on, wherever you are in your clinical development program, if you're in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Phase 3 are your pivotal studies where you're saying, we know this drug works, we want a license, here is the data, give us a license. That's what the phase 3 studies show. So think about this really, really early on and prove to us that you're thinking about this, and we will help you. The other thing I just want to plug is come and have some scientific advice. Those of you that work in SMEs, so small and medium enterprises, you can ask for scientific advice. And that's not us telling you how to do your study. It's us showing you what you need to show us from a regulatory perspective that what you're doing is safe. Please, please use that. It's there. And there'll be a host of different experts that can advise you. Drug development, device development, please use that, because if you don't, and you then want to have your license, we're going to say no, because you haven't followed the right channels, okay?
So it sounds scary, but I have to be honest and say that my meetings with the regulators have always been incredibly encouraging, because as an obstetrician, I can turn around and say to them, look, every single one of my patients is pregnant, and therefore that's normal for me. And actually, as a maternal fetal medicine specialist, every single one of my patients has a problem, such as an increased risk of preterm birth, a fetal growth restriction, or they might have a maternal medical problem. So this is my bread and butter. So I feel incredibly comfortable talking to women about risk and benefit. And we know from conducting trials of repurposed drugs, so for example, using sildenafil citrate, a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. Some of you will know it a little bit more like that little blue pill, Viagra. So that drug has been used in pregnancy to try to treat fetal growth restriction, to improve the outcomes for these very small babies that stop growing in the womb. Unfortunately, it didn't work at the dose that it was given. And that's one of the issues, is that we have so little research going on in this area that very often we jump straight into using a dose that we think is probably safe, but may not be effective. And certainly there is some evidence to show that some of the trials that used sildenafil citrate were not using it at a high enough dose to be effective. But the issue is, we recruited to this trial in the UK ahead of time. Now, I've never heard of a study recruiting ahead of time. It was amazing. These women wanted to have the treatment. And the thing is, they knew that if they took part in a clinical trial, whether they were in the placebo arm or whether they were in the intervention arm, they were going to have a better outcome because they were being looked after by clinicians who were experts in the condition that their baby had. And so they were very thankful to take part in the trial. And I had a number of patients who found out subsequently, after 2 years, that their baby had not. They had not taken the active drug, and they were very happy that they had actually been given the opportunity to take part in a trial. So I think we need to bust this myth straight out of the water. Pregnant women are generally willing to take part in a trial, particularly if they are in a very difficult situation where they have a very high risk of losing a pregnancy. So I see women routinely in my clinic in the fetal medicine unit that have a 50% chance of having a perinatal loss, their baby dying before birth because their baby stops growing in the womb. And these women are desperate to try something. They're not desperate to try anything, but they're willing to take the risk. And I think that's a really important message to get out there. I think in terms of the diversity message as well, Jan, what is a sort of ICH and the wider global picture doing on this to try to increase participation of pregnant women and lactating women in trials?
Yeah, so ICH, for those of you that don't know what that is, it's an organisation, it's kind of the International Harmonisation Committee that tries to ensure that industry trials that are done globally are done to a similar sort of standard. And they basically hold all the regulators to account to say that you're sort of trying to do similar things. And ICH at the moment are developing a pregnancy-specific guideline on inclusion of pregnancy and lactating individuals in clinical trials. It's currently being drafted and revised at the moment. It looks really good, and I think it will go some way in improving some of this. But it doesn't solve the problem, as Peter has already identified, of there being interest in this field. I think academics, particularly academics who work in obstetrics and gynecology, of which there are several leaders in this country, really, I think, need to take this bait and engage with industry. I know it's really hard. I know that there's lots of barriers. But please do that, because otherwise this needle will never move forward.
So just moving on, thinking about drug development in pregnancy, Peter, what are the most promising areas of drug development, do you think, for pregnancy-related conditions?
Well, I mean, we've mentioned the two biggest ones, preeclampsia and preterm labour. You know, we haven't had a new treatment for this. I mean, there's so few drugs licensed in pregnancy, and we still have a massive problem with this condition, not just in developed countries, but around the world. And those are areas of real unmet need. Obviously, there's lots of other conditions in pregnancy, but those are the big two. The big two where babies are either risk dying or being damaged as a consequence of the pregnancy. And I think those are enormously challenging issues. But I also want to touch on the other issue, which is in many Western societies, women are delaying pregnancy until they're older. And so they often have pre-existing medical conditions when they come into pregnancy. And there's a real problem there. As has already been said, lots of women will take a medication during pregnancy. Some will take lots of medications, but some will need to take medication throughout their pregnancy. And knowing that that medication is safe or not, or whether they need to be changed to something safer, and how you manage that when you've got very little information available, is really tricky. And it's partly because women are excluded from randomised trials. And I don't want to be a complete naysayer and say everything's gloomy and miserable and horrible. But some of you will remember the recovery trials. You know about the recovery trial for COVID? This was treatment for COVID in hospital. So the initial trial, which was multi-arm trial trying lots of new therapies, initially excluded pregnant women. But very quickly, with lots of lobbying from many of us, included pregnant women in the trials. So pregnant women were being recruited just as other people who were admitted to hospital with severe COVID were being recruited, which is a fantastic example of something that can happen. You can get pregnant women in these trials. These pregnant women were happy to be in these trials. They'd got symptomatic COVID, which had admitted them to hospital. So they were fearful for themselves and for their baby. And the drugs we were mostly testing we had some comfort with. They weren't completely new and experimental most of the time, and there'd been some experience with the use in pregnancy, so it felt safe to include them. Now, by the same token, the COVID vaccine trials excluded all pregnant women. So when we started vaccinating routinely in the UK, it got to the stage where 1 in 5 people with COVID in intensive care units in the country was a pregnant woman, because they were not being offered the vaccine, because people were uncertain of its safety or not. Well, of course, because they hadn't been given the vaccine in a clinical trial setting where you could monitor that safety. So even in the recent history, we've got that sort of dichotomy of wanting, the basic response from people is to exclude pregnant women because it's too risky, it's too complicated, it's too horrible. But increasingly women are going to be taking medicines during pregnancy, not just for pregnancy-specific conditions like preeclampsia and preterm birth, but because they need it for their health. And a healthy baby, a healthy mum usually equals a healthy baby. Not always, but you can't. It's difficult to have a healthy baby if you've got a really sick mum. So you do need to manage the mother's medical condition, and increasingly we need to think about that pipeline as well in all new drug development and evaluation. And that's been done in paediatrics, so we can do it in obstetrics.
So thinking about safety, one of the issues that I came up against during developing a drug for fetal growth restriction was the fact that we had almost no terminology for defining adverse events. An adverse event is a harm or something that happens when somebody is having a medical condition, and it can be potentially related to a drug or an intervention, but it may not be related to that at all. It might be simply part of the disease that they have. And when we were thinking about a fetal growth restriction, there were only 4 adverse events describing the fetus. They were either a small fetus, they were stillborn, they shouldn't have been conceived in the first place, or there was another. And if you imagine that the CTCAE, so the Common Terminology of Cancer Adverse Events terminology, contains over 830 specific definitions of adverse events, 49 for dermatology conditions alone, and we had only 4 for the fetus, we decided we had to do something about it. And so we developed an international consensus, and we have now developed a terminology called MFET, which allows us to define and grade adverse events in the fetus and also in the mother. And we introduced them to MEDRA, the Medical Dictionary Regulator Activities. So now they are available for companies to use and to be able to say their drug is safe, because actually that's what they need to do to convince the regulator that their drug is safe. But that only was published in 2021. So you can see we are really quite far behind the curve. We've recently developed some lactation breastfeeding adverse events and introduced 2 new descriptions of terminology so that we can actually assess safety during lactation, because that's another time that really there's very little available for women, and in terms of drug safety, we just don't know much about it. But I wondered what you thought about this new terminology. I mean, I think it's really important that it's taken forward. But how can we encourage companies and people doing clinical trials to use it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good initiative, Anna. As you know, I am behind it as far as I can be. I think that thinking about the fact that in pregnancy there is a risk that things can go wrong, but things can go wrong in any drug trial or any trial generally. But thinking about that early, thinking about your mitigation and who do you need, who's your friend at the end of the phone that you can ring to say, this has happened in my trial, I'm not sure if this is related to the drug or if this is related to a woman's the course of her pregnancy, particularly if you're doing a really risky trial in, for example, women that have severe preeclampsia, and you just don't know, is this the disease course or is this actually my drug doing this? Something like this is really valuable. And I think from a regulatory perspective, it's nice to have a framework to think about, well, what do these signals really mean? And is this something that eventually needs to be included in a label or not? So it's very helpful.
So looking at sort of the key differences about taking drugs in pregnancy. There's issues with changes in the sort of medication metabolism. What other issues do we need to consider when you're doing some kind of modelling, Amin?
I think the starting point is to understand the biology of the basically pregnant women in different stages. And, I told you that there have been data, but not enough, particularly in those conditions that you are talking about. But with the technology is becoming available, obviously, I think, we are getting, better and better. But going back to, to how we actually assess, sort of what we are doing, whether the adjustment of the dose, reducing higher, etc., even in a trial, later on is going to be assessed as, is it this, sort of harmed or actually it was beneficial, etc. One discussion that earlier we had before we started is the combination of what people call the real-world evidence analysis versus actually the modeling. Because many people, when we talk about the models, they immediately come and say, how you are going to validate? And this is the wrong question to ask. Because if I was able to go and validate, why I am doing the modeling? I just go and do the study. This is the, the problem that we have got, that people actually cannot perhaps grasp that, how these models are supposed to be working. They are giving us, indication of what, the insurance should be. What is the best thing in the complete absence of data that we can do, clinical study, etc. But if we want to see whether at the end they really worked or not, particularly in a situation like this, the only thing is to actually to analyze the data later on from real-world evidence and connect back to what you had done. And this is done in other areas. I gave an example, Jenny, earlier on that was related to the drug-drug interaction in renal impairment. You can't go and actually ask renally impaired people to come and intentionally get combination of drugs so you can see, what's going to happen. This is impossible. But FDA in 2011 pushed one of the drug companies, J&J, in rivaroxaban, one of their drugs, to put something in the label which was purely on the basis of the modeling. Said they are in a higher danger and you have to put this reduction in dose. J&J screamed up and down, but eventually, FDA has got the higher, power. They put that, but there was no clinical evidence until 10 years later on. Actually, our late colleague, Joe Grillo from FDA published, doing the full circle with a real-world evidence indicating what decision they had made was correct. And I fully agree with many of these. We need better markers of, sort of whether the side effect, we can't go with the 4 indication that, I know from my wife that, for instance, the APGAR, she's telling me that, it is only on the basis of, many aspects on the basis of his skin color, and we haven't even considered different ethnic group. Apparently, she's part of the fight that's going on in the APGAR score. But, sort of these kind of things, you start thinking, what? We haven't really sorted out anything that tells us, the health of the baby and how we can link that to what we did. So all of these are interconnected. And one point, also going back to, your comment earlier on, how well UK is doing on these. I think this is very important to realize. I told you Certara is a global company, but all the mechanistic modeling of the Certara, both in the space of which I am PBPK, physiological-based pharmacokinetics, as well as quantitative systems pharmacology, they are UK-based. We are doing very well, hitting much higher than our, sort of, I would say, punching much higher than our, sort of weight. And for those areas, we have started recently to work also with our regulatory colleagues with regard to regulators if they suddenly get flood of these kind of submissions. I don't think they are actually geared up to assess that, because this also happened within FDA. Once all of these were coming, see how we are going to assess that, because they have to develop guidance for it, etc., etc. So we are working with our regulatory colleagues to create something in actually UK, which is called Center for Regulatory Innovation and Scientific Innovation, CERSI, they are called. They are already coming in US, but nothing at the moment in UK. Going forward, hopefully we will be able to have many of the colleagues that they are geared up to assessment of these kind of conditions, these kind of submissions. So definitely, to me, future is bright with regard to the applications.
So I think you're right. It's a really positive message. I think one other thing to think about is that pregnancy conditions are eligible for orphan drug disease. So one might think it's slightly crazy that a disease that is common in pregnancy fits the bill for being less than a 5 per 10,000 prevalence annually. But in fact, only half the population can get pregnant. You're only pregnant 9 months at the time. You only have the condition, like preeclampsia, made halfway through pregnancy. And so we identified that actually fetal growth restriction, as well as preterm labour, as well as preeclampsia, are orphan drug diseases. And that means that companies can get free scientific advice. It's a much easier way through to getting regulatory advice, and it means they get extra time on their patent as well. So it's a really important message that pregnancy conditions are orphan diseases. It might seem strange, but it is not strange at all. Are there any other final comments? And one other thing I wanted to point out, we're going to put up some resources up here for people to have a look at. There's a QR code that you can download. So some of the things that we mentioned in the discussion this afternoon are there for you. Any final comments, Peter?
I just want to, I feel as if I'm being the naysayer all the time here, but safety in pregnancy exposures is not just short term. So we need to, thalidomide was relatively easy very easy to spot shortly after the birth. But there's another example, which is diethylstilbestrol, which was a synthetic estrogen given to women who were experiencing miscarriages. It didn't work at preventing miscarriages, and it didn't seem to have any problem. But the female fetuses exposed to diethylstilbestrol, when they got to their early 20s, some of them developed a very rare form of vaginal cancer. And the boys, some of the male fetuses, had severe infertility. So once you're exposing a fetus, which is a rapidly developing organism, to a new agent, you do have to keep in mind that the fact that may be long-term unintended consequences, which may be very, very rare, but may be very severe, in which case it can be quite difficult in clinical trials to detect that. So at the beginning, I talked about the UK being a fantastic place to do these clinical trials, because you can follow them up for their lifetime, and potentially for multi-generations, you can link the data to from a pregnancy, and then the pregnancy of those fetuses when they get pregnant, and so on and so forth. And you can look and be reassured relatively inexpensively. Very, very cheaply. You don't have to do actual face-to-face follow-up. But I think that also is another lesson which is lurking in the back of developers' minds about the potential consequences. And you don't really see that in many other areas of healthcare, that long-term adverse consequences. Because by the time those have happened, most of the people who've given the drug to are already dead of something else. So, it is the consequence of doing something in pregnancy. So it's just something that needs to be borne in mind.
And the NHS can provide that long-term follow-up, can't it? Yeah. Any final comments?
I would say that these things, change of basically paradigm of how we are developing the drugs in general and so on, takes a long time. I always mention William James, quote that on other areas that we started, like drug-drug interaction, which was 10 years before we started to do the pregnancy models and so on. That when these kind of things start, the first thing that people will say was, "Oh, this is not true. It cannot be right." And then you show that it is true. You can actually work with them. They are correct. They are working. And then they come and say, "Oh, this is not important." And you come and show, no, it is important. It's helping with insurance. It's helping with the clinical design, etc., etc. And then it becomes to a level of acceptance with a much higher level of the population. That when you start to talk about, you say, why you are wasting our time? We all know about that. So I'm hoping in 10 years' time, come back here, and everybody, when I'm talking about this, saying that why you are wasting our time? All of us, we know that.
Fantastic. Jan, final thoughts.
Final thoughts from me are, thank you, Peter, for that point. So the Safer Medicines in Pregnancy Consortium is a group that is a body of lots of different clinicians, as well as other stakeholders like the agency, but also other people like the Royal Colleges who all come together to try and provide some advice in the absence of good data for pregnant women. So that is an access point that you can use if you are a clinician in the field. But I think without future drug development, without thinking about inclusion properly at the beginning, we're never going to move the needle forward. So I really hope that this is a call to arms for those of you that are clinicians or that are drug developers or working with drug developers, that you really think about working with your colleagues properly. And if you see stuff that you don't think makes sense, call it out and talk to people, talk to us. We'll try and help you.
So we haven't really got much time left, but are there any burning questions out there in the audience? Have we stunned you into silence? Somebody there, yes.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering about, at the beginning of the talk, you were talking about how so many drugs aren't actually tested in pregnant women, but end up being used anyway because of the risk-benefit ratio. And how often are those sort of then followed up and monitored? And is there a sort of method that could then be used to support with safety data and et cetera? Is it the yellow card scheme, or are there sort of additional kind of routes?
Jan, maybe over to you.
Sounds like a question for me. Yes. The yellow card scheme is one. There are other pregnancy registers that exist. So there's pregnancy registers for specific diseases. So, for example, there might be a particular rheumatoid arthritis charity, for example. They might hold for certain things. The agency does hold a vast amount of data. Individual companies will hold data on kind of, I suppose, off-label prescribing. But the vast majority of off-label prescribing, we don't have sight of. So if there are innovative ways of solving that, or that you can think of ways of providing that solution, I'm all ears.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? So I'm just going to finish off by saying there are lots of drugs going into clinical trial. So, for example, in preeclampsia, there's about 4 different clinical trials currently ongoing, looking at statins or metformin for preeclampsia, and very much it's looking at repurposing drugs. But also, there are new drugs that are coming through. So, for example, DM199, affecting the bradykinin pathway, is being taken through by Diomedica Therapeutics. And then the soluble FLT1 siRNA from Comanche Biopharma, called CBP4888, is being taken forward for preeclampsia as well. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a dead field. This is a really exciting field. I think the UK is driving it forward. We have lots of opportunity. And if you're interested to know more, please contact us. Contact details are up on the QR code, and get in touch and find out if you'd like to know more about this area. Thank you very much for coming along. And thank you to my panel. Brilliant.
Thanks.